Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs Victoria, from the virtual, obviously, as we currently sit in Melbourne in very trying lockdowns. All the very best to everyone joining us today, and I hope you're all very well. Tonight we have something really rather special. 2021 marks the 70th anniversary of the Australia, New Zealand and United States Security Treaty, ANZUS, as it's most commonly referred to. Formed on the 1st of September, it symbolises the long-standing Australia-US security alliance. Tonight, we have with us Dr. Emma Shortis, who is a nationally recognised expert on the history and politics of the United States and a research fellow at RMIT University. And we're also co-hosts the RMIT's popular history podcast, Barely Getting By, which I highly recommend to everyone. In her now released book, Our Exceptional Friend, Dr. Shortis questions Australia's relationship with the United States. She draws on current affairs and history and questions of morality to mount a compelling and rather unique case as to why Australia's relationship with the US, and indeed inherently, I guess, New Zealand, needs a serious overhaul. Australians are told that we only have two choices, the US or China. Faced with that choice, our governments at a federal level have seemed to always side with the US, even if it means siding with a president like Donald J. Trump. So tonight we invite Emma into the AAA Victoria to comment upon everything that ANZUS means and what it may mean for our future. Tonight we'll have a talk by Emma and then questions. So please do put them in the chat, and hopefully we can get to your question and ask Emma that. But now I will hand over to Emma. Emma, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, James, for that absolutely lovely and generous introduction. I would like to begin, of course, by acknowledging the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands I live and I work, and I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past and present. I would also like to just quickly extend my thanks to Alistair Roth, who invited me to speak to you here at the AIIA. He invited me, of course, in the expectation that we would be together in person, but of course, as James says, you know, this is the situation that we find ourselves in. And I guess in the spirit of my own and no doubt your Zoom fatigue, I wanted to thank you so much for logging on to hear me speak about ANZUS tonight. But also I just kind of wanted to say that I haven't prepared a PowerPoint because I didn't want to make this a lecture. I'm kind of imagining that, you know, as I'm speaking to you, you're wrapping up your workday or you're on your evening walk or, you know, you're cooking dinner. So I wanted to make it a more kind of, I suppose, casual conversation in that spirit. And I also really wanted to, I guess, in that kind of spirit of sharing, to say that I am indeed a historian. As James said, I've approached the Australia's relationship with the United States and the ANZUS Treaty specifically through a kind of historical analysis. You know, I'm not a scholar of international relations. I'm not a security studies person. So that's kind of my perspective, I suppose. And I found that even since researching and writing and publishing the book, history has really feels like it's kind of looming large in both Australia and the United States in a way that it doesn't always do. You know, I think history doesn't always feel so present. And I think that's partly because, you know, as James acknowledged, kind of everywhere you look at the moment in both the United States and Australia, there's some kind of important historical anniversary or historic milestone, you know, sometimes both at once. And they sometimes seem to be kind of coming, I think, in a way, taking us by surprise. You know, you only have to look to the United States in the last couple of days to see one of those important milestones playing out in that Hurricane Ida a Category 5 tropical storm made landfall in Louisiana on the very same day that Hurricane Katrina made landfall 16 years earlier. And of course, Hurricane Ida is in many ways significantly bigger and scarier than Hurricane Katrina, which killed 1,800 Americans, mostly poor Americans and Americans of colour. And Ida 16 years later is significantly scarier and bigger and worse, because in that intervening period, Australia and the United States failed to act collectively on climate change. So I think that's one of the ways that history is really looming large for both countries. It's also, of course, as many of you will know, the 20th anniversary of September 11, the September 11 attacks next week. And in Australia, that means also we've just passed the 20th anniversary of the Tampa refugee crisis, where the Howard government refused entry to people seeking asylum. And, you know, I suppose most importantly, for me, the reason I'm here speaking to you, it's also tomorrow, in fact, the 70th anniversary of that official security treaty between Australia and the United States, the ANZUS Treaty. And that, you know, that milestone would always get, I think, a significant amount of attention here. It's why I'm speaking to you now. But I think the United States and Australia's withdrawal from Afghanistan gives that historic milestone, I suppose, an extra element of poignancy and reflection. And that's, you know, partly my job as a historian. And I suppose my reason for highlighting those histories and those important historical milestones is because in our conversations about not just the relationship between Australia and the United States, but kind of Australia's role in the world more broadly, those historic incidents are largely treated separately. So we don't connect them to each other. We don't connect that kind of collective failure to act on climate to the question of who suffers as a result of American and Australian power, to the alliance, to the ANZUS Security Treaty. And the ANZUS Treaty is generally understood in Australia to be about war and security alone. So we can connect it to 9/11, we can connect it to the war in Afghanistan, but we can't necessarily connect it to Tampa or that anniversary of Hurricane Katrina and that failure to act on climate. And what I argue in the book is that disconnect really tells us a lot about the history and the present of Australia's relationship with the United States. It tells us a lot about our shared values, I suppose, as so many prime ministers and presidents have described them. But to give you, I suppose, a more, I guess, a tangible example of what I'm talking about in terms of that disconnect between those shared values and shared histories and the ANZUS Treaty, you can look again to the war in Afghanistan and the withdrawal of the United States and Australia, because in my experience, at least, you know, almost anything you read about the withdrawal will describe the war in Afghanistan as the United States and Australia's longest war. So before that, the war in Afghanistan, our longest war was the war in Vietnam, which of course Afghanistan surpassed a decade ago. And that's repeated in coverage over and over again. But the war in Afghanistan is only Australia and the United States' longest war if we erase the frontier wars in both the United States and Australia. And that really highlights, you know, I think as much as that could be put down to an issue of semantics, for me, what that does is really highlight those shared histories and our inability to connect those deeper shared histories with the relationship and what it does to the world. But those things aren't separate. And it's those broader shared histories of dispossession, of racism, of environmental destruction, and vast and increasing economic inequality on both sides of the Pacific that I really want to talk about today. Rather than just focusing on ANZUS itself and the ANZUS Treaty itself, I want to focus on how the ANZUS Treaty and its foundation in war reinforces and perpetuates those structural injustices when it comes to race, when it comes to climate change, and when it comes to economics. Okay, so the question then becomes, of course, how does ANZUS do that? Because I'm really well aware that we're not used to thinking of ANZUS in those terms. But it does that in part by dramatically oversimplifying the way that we, Australian governments in particular, see the world. ANZUS, the security treaty, really conceives of the world in binary terms. You know, for I suppose, to put it crudely, it conceives of a world full of friends and enemies, or even kind of goodies and baddies, to use a phrase of a former prime minister. And the alliance has really done that. It's been grounded in that kind of binary thinking from the beginning. Now, I'm sure that many of you are kind of familiar with the story of that official security relationship between Australia and the United States, which is born out of the Second World War and an experience of shared war. And as that story kind of, I suppose, commonly goes, in the early 1940s, it becomes undeniable to Australian governments in particular that the British government, the British Empire, can no longer be relied upon to protect the Commonwealth, to protect Australia and New Zealand in the Pacific. And so what Australia and New Zealand at the time do is look logically and automatically for another protector. You know, white Australians are used to their security being provided by a much bigger power, and so they kind of naturally look to the United States to protect them from this threat in war. And that, again, is kind of generally accepted as logical and necessary. But what that common history often kind of glosses over or overlooks is that by the time the ANZUS Treaty was signed in 1951, we're nearly a decade past the end of the Second World War, and Japan, if it ever did, no longer poses an existential threat to Australia, and nor do any of the other countries in the region. And yet the Australian government still made this choice to seek out another benevolent white protector. And that's really because the Australian government looked out into the region and saw an ongoing existential threat from our particularly non-white neighbours, and so sourced American protection. That's why Menzies wanted the security alliance, and that again is why so many people support it today. Now, of course, today the enemy that ANZUS is oriented towards is not Japan. Other countries have had their turn. You know, Indonesia, for example, has had its turn, Korea, Vietnam. But today, the enemy that ANZUS has found is China. And ANZUS itself and all of the apparatus around it has oriented itself completely towards China. I'm not going to speak about China a lot tonight because I want to focus specifically on the relationship between the United States and Australia, but I'm more than happy to speak about that more in depth in questions if you would like to. What I will say now, what I'd emphasize is that the ANZUS Treaty, ANZUS needs an enemy. It needs an enemy. And what that reflects is a really dramatic distortion in Australian foreign policy and security thinking. That's, you know, that we have this ongoing existential threat from our non-white neighbours, and also that danger or that threat can only ever be conceived of as coming from other people, and particularly other people who don't look like our governments. And that has incredibly significant and very real consequences for Australia in the world. And I want to give you a particular example of how that mindset of military threat from other people affects Australian policy. So in June 2020, the Morrison government announced a new $270 billion defence and security strategy, part of which involved the announcement that Australia would spend $800 million on some new American missiles. Now, this formed a kind of part of a long tradition, really, of Australian defence procurement from the United States. So in 2017, the Australian government itself estimated that the Australian Defence Force had spent 10 billion Australian dollars on American weapons and equipment in only the preceding 4 years. So this is kind of eye-watering amounts of money. Now, this announcement of this $800 million spend came in June 2020. Donald Trump was president. We know how close the Morrison government and the Trump administration were. And of course, this is also in the midst of a pandemic that we are still suffering through. just a few months before that announcement of that military spend, the Trump administration had announced its Operation Warp Speed, which is the program designed to develop vaccines. Now, it apparently didn't occur to anybody negotiating these defence contracts that perhaps the Morrison government could use its closeness with the Trump administration to perhaps negotiate something like a pre-purchase agreement for the vaccines that the Trump administration was developing. And, you know, we are feeling these consequences play out in a very real way, where instead of turning to Australia's very best friend in the world for help in this situation, Australia is instead going to Poland to procure vaccine supplies. Now, that has partly happened, I would argue, because, at least partly happened, because of the way that Australia's relationship with the United States is oriented so completely towards war and militarism. So threat comes from other people, and the relationship just isn't set up to deal with the kind of threat that a pandemic poses. Which then, I guess, brings me to another threat that the alliance has, at least so far, proved unable to tackle collectively, to even really understand as the global threat it is, and that is climate change. Again, we don't usually, or we're not encouraged to connect ANZUS to climate change and to Australia's failure to address climate change, to act on climate change, and the US's historic failures as well. I think we were encouraged to see the change of president in the United States as something that might change that relationship and change things when it came to climate change. So when Joe Biden in particular was elected with you know, what can be argued are pretty radical climate policies, especially compared to the Trump administration, there was a perception in Australia that would lead to a change here too. So when Scott Morrison had his press conference to congratulate Joe Biden on his election, for example, the very first question he was asked was by the Australian media was whether this election would change Australian climate policy, because Joe Biden had declared a return to global leadership on climate, and the expectation was that his administration would put significant pressure on the Australian government, which would then have to change its policies. What I argue in the book is that ANZUS and the way that the relationship is oriented completely around defence and security and the military is that the Australian government really could rest assured, it can still rest assured, that that pressure won't eventuate in anything other than specific climate forums or in kind of diplomatic discussions, that it won't affect the core of Australia's military and security relationship with the United States. And that's in part because the Australian government has learned its own historic lessons from our relationship with the United States. It can go back, for example, to the Kyoto Protocol negotiations in 1997, before which the Clinton administration had declared a return to global climate leadership on the part of the United States, had negotiated the Kyoto Protocol, while the Australian government, the Australian negotiating team under Howard, almost tried to torpedo these agreements, the Kyoto Protocol agreements, extracting ridiculous concessions for Australia when it came to climate emissions, and in doing so suffered no real consequences from the United States or for the security relationship. And then, of course, proceeded to watch American climate leadership collapse when Congress refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and then when Clinton's successor, George Bush, kind of removed the United States from any obligations under the Kyoto Protocol altogether, and in doing so, kind of torpedoing any potential for significant global action on climate. So the Australian government is kind of, I suspect, expecting that history will repeat itself in this way. And I think we can already see that playing out, despite these kind of promises of American pressure when it comes to climate change, and all this anticipation, when Scott Morrison first met Joe Biden at the G7 meeting in Cornwall, there's expectation that it would be all about climate. And it turns out, in fact, that meeting becomes all about China. It becomes all about security, and that, again, that part of the relationship, that core of the relationship between the United States and Australia is oriented towards an enemy, a military enemy in China, and climate comes second. And so what that does, I argue, is again reinforce the kind of structural injustices of Australian and American foreign policy. It does things like encourage the Australian government's apathy towards our Pacific neighbours. And it again is reflective not just of that kind of shorter history of climate inaction in Australia and the United States, but it's also reflective again of those much deeper shared values that ANZUS reinforce, in this case of kind of extractive capitalism that supports and encourages the extraction of fossil fuels and non-renewable energy. And again, you know, I hope you'll stay with me when I argue that this is part of that deeper historical connection, that those values play out all the time and reinforce each other. And again, I want to give you another specific example of that shared history kind of reinforcing itself across the Pacific, or I guess in parallel. So in May 2020, some of you may remember the Anglo-Australian mining company Rio Tinto blew up a 46,000-year-old Aboriginal heritage site at Yukon Gorge in Western Australia. So a parliamentary inquiry found that Rio knew the value of what they were destroying, but they blew it up anyway in order to access higher grade ore, so to make money. This is the kind of extractive capitalism that I'm talking about. There were some consequences for this. Some people lost their jobs. There were some fines, but there weren't structural changes. And this, again, may seem, you know, a particularly Australian concern. It may seem disconnected from our relationship with the United States, but it absolutely isn't, because the relationship reinforces this kind of racist, extractive capitalism. Less than a year later, Rio Tinto was at it again, this time in the United States, in Arizona, where the Trump administration was taking steps to hand over Apache land this time so that Rio Tinto could establish the world's biggest copper mine. Now, this process of handing over First Nations land for the extraction of non-renewable resources began under the Obama administration. It was continued by Trump, and it's continuing under the Biden administration. So we can see here the parallels of those shared values and the way that they reinforce each other. And I appreciate that the threads, I suppose, can be difficult to see, but they are there. And what I am arguing, I suppose, and what I argue in the book is that the ANZUS Treaty, as it forms the core of Australia's relationship with the United States, traps all of us collectively in this exploitative, extractive, and deeply racist economic model. And we can see that racism playing out not just in Western Australia, not just in Arizona, but across the world. And again, it is reinforced continually by our relationship with the United States. And if we look more recently, we can see it playing out in the United States and Australia's withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the way that both governments have mishandled the evacuation process, and not just mishandled, but the way that that process or that failure has played into, again, those deeper shared histories and shared values. So you may have seen that the Australian Defence Minister, when he was being asked about the evacuation of Afghans to Australia, Afghan refugees to Australia, responded by suggesting that, you know, Australia had to tread very carefully, the Australian government had to process these visas very carefully, because there was significant potential for these refugees to pose a security threat to Australia, which is not dissimilar to the way Fox News commentator Tucker Carlson in the United States recently suggested that the acceptance of Afghan refugees into the United States would constitute an invasion. Australia's relationship, the Australian government's relationship with the United States government and a media environment as well, reinforces narratives like that. And again, that has origins in our historic relationship, and another important historic milestone that I mentioned earlier, which is the Tampa refugee crisis. So, you'll note that the 20th anniversary of Tampa was, I think, a week ago now, and the 20th anniversary of 9/11 is the following week. Those events happened very close together, and the Howard government's response to refugees seeking asylum in Australia, its demonisation of those refugees, its refusal to allow them entry into Australia, was then deeply reinforced less than a month later by the attacks of September 11 and the Howard and Bush government's responses to that. Those two events in parallel, I think, are widely credited with winning the Howard government that election. And as I argue in the book, the Howard government's enthusiastic participation in the Bush administration's war on terror continued that process of demonization of other people, particularly of Muslims, of course, but also of anybody really who looked like they might be Muslim in the depths of the war on terror. And that narrative, Australia's participation in the war on terror, its enthusiastic participation, its invocation of the ANZUS Treaty in the aftermath of 9/11, significantly contributed to a process of really emboldening and encouraging white supremacy, both in the United States and in Australia. And so, as I argue in the book, we can really draw a direct line from Australia's support for and participation in the war on terror, which continues despite the withdrawal from Afghanistan, to events like the massacre of Muslim people in Christchurch a couple of years ago, which was carried out by a white Australian man. So again, I think, so often we see the ANZUS Treaty and these questions of security as kind of so high level and so removed from events on the ground. But what I argue is that the way that ANZUS functions is to reinforce those elements of white supremacy, those networks of white supremacy between Australia and the United States. And again, that has very real and very significant and terrible consequences for people on the ground. I think, sometimes the fact that that incident, the Christchurch massacre, happened during the Trump years, has led many people to kind of assume that the worst of that relationship, the worst of Australia's relationship with the United States, can be isolated to the Trump presidency. And indeed, I don't want to focus on Trump too much, precisely because he wasn't an aberration. We can't isolate that relationship between the Australian government and the Trump administration in kind of historical brackets. It's part of a longer history of, those shared values that I talked about. But Trump, he did, he highlighted a lot. He said the quiet part loud often. And what he did was, again, just highlight how far the Australian government is willing to go, how much it's structurally oriented towards supporting and encouraging American power, really, no matter who is in charge in Washington and no matter what they do. And again, we saw that play out in fairly obvious ways, where the Morrison government becomes, towards the end of the Trump administration, really its best friend in the world. Scott Morrison was one of the only global leaders to be invited to something like a state dinner at the White House. So there's that, I guess, obvious kind of reinforcement of the relationship, but it also happened in other ways, in ways that reinforce things like economic inequality. And to highlight that on this kind of whistle-stop tour, I would draw your attention to Trump's Space Force, which kind of provided one of the few moments of levity, I suppose, in the Trump administration, when Trump established what was supposed to be an entirely new branch of the American Defense Forces, Space Force. When Scott Morrison went to the United States to have this state dinner hosted in his honor by Donald Trump, one of the things he did was announce $150 million in funding for the Australian space industry, part of which was designed to kind of tap into this increase in activity, in militarized activity in space. And Australia is now deeply enmeshed in Space Force, which has continued beyond its life in the Trump administration. We saw that with the launch of an Australian satellite on a SpaceX rocket this week. And again, what that highlights, the fact that this was launched on one of Elon Musk's SpaceX rockets, shows just how deeply enmeshed Australia is with American capital and how much it reinforces that vast and increasing economic inequality. Space Force has billions of dollars of contracts with the Pentagon, with American defense forces. And so Australia, through its investment of 150 million through its own space industry, is deeply implicated in that, in Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk's kind of dreams of conquering space, which is deeply connected again to the projection of American military power. So in that, the Australian government really implicates Australia and Australians in this American-led militarization and colonization and commercialization of space. So yet again, that's another way that I think ANZUS kind of, I suppose, reinforces those deeper shared values of colonization, of economic inequality, and also, I think, quite clearly, those deep histories of dispossession. So this has been a kind of, I suppose, a long whistle-stop tour of some of the examples and the historic and current events that I draw on in the book to make this argument about the way that Australia reinforces American power, and the way that that is all underpinned by the ANZUS Treaty and the orientation of our entire foreign and security policy towards militarism and towards this idea of existential threat. So I guess in my, the kind of final 5 minutes or so, if I just check the time, the thing that I wanted to discuss is a question that comes up for me all the time. Given if we take this as given, if we take my argument about the nature of ANZUS and what it does to Australian foreign policy and the way that Australia acts in the world, what do we do about it? How do we fix this problem? And I think it's often assumed, or people often assume, probably fair enough, that what I'm advocating for is kind of chucking out ANZUS, just scrapping ANZUS and starting again. That's not what I'm advocating for, at least partly because I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that's likely to happen, but also because, scrapping ANZUS wouldn't scrap the structures that I've talked about, the structures that reinforce that kind of economic and environmental and racist destruction. So I'm not necessarily for scrapping ANZUS, and I'm also not anti-American, which is another accusation I face. I hope, that I've been careful as I've been speaking to be clear that what I'm talking about is the projection of Australian and American power. So the role of Australian governments, of American governments, and Australian and American, I guess, kind of defense establishments. So I'm not anti-American in that sense. I'm I guess, railing against the exercise of American power and Australian support of it. But again, there's that question, kind of, what do we do about this? And I want to, again, be really open and say, I don't know. I don't have a 3-step plan. It's really kind of customary in these kind of analyses of international relations to say, here's the problem and here are the steps the Australian government needs to take to fix that. I don't have that kind of prescription for Australian policy. I don't think, that's not necessarily my job as a historian, but I think it's also really important to highlight that it's not my job as an individual. I think Australian foreign policy still is driven specifically by a number of individuals, and it shouldn't be. I think any attempt to reform both Australia's relationship with the United States and Australian foreign policy more generally should be a much more collective process. It shouldn't just be driven by particularly powerful individuals. And so what I'm advocating for is not necessarily a scrapping of ANZUS, but a deeper reconsideration of Australian foreign policy, of Australia's role in the world, and how that relates to Australian democracy. The other question I'm kind of faced with, kind of, I suppose, given that is, what else do we do? Who else is there? Who else is there to protect us? And I hope it's kind of clear that, you know, I am hoping to, aspiring for a world in which Australia and Australian governments don't feel afraid and don't feel the need to seek out protection from a much bigger power. They don't feel the need to have a threat hanging over them when we look out into our region. But I'm also not advocating, I think, for just a kind of more independent Australian foreign policy. In fact, what I'm really arguing for, and I hope I've kind of at least hinted for, is a much deeper reckoning with those shared values that Australia has with the United States. It's a way, I suppose, a reckoning with that relationship between militarization and economic inequality, between militarization and a failure to act on climate change. This is often, I suppose, thrown back at me as something naive, as a misunderstanding of the true nature of the world. And my response to that would be to say that as a historian, I don't see the world as fixed. The world that we live in now is not inevitable. War and conflict is not inevitable. And what ANZUS does is almost force Australian governments to see the world in that way. I think, and I argue in the book, that we are allowed to ask for better than what we have out of our relationship with the United States and out of Australia's role in the world. I don't think it's naive to aspire to a better world, to aspire to a relationship with the United States that isn't reinforcing climate injustice, that isn't reinforcing racial injustice, that isn't reinforcing economic injustice. It's not naive, it's in fact necessary to ask for something better than that and a better role for Australia in the world with it. So I will leave it there with that kind of open-ended hope or aspiration, and really hand over to you for questions. I can see there are already quite a few in the chat, so I'll hand back to James to deal with those.
Well, thank you, Emma. That was quite extraordinary. You might have called it a whistle stop tour at one point, but seemed like you stopped a lot longer at different stations and was able to really quite coherently explain what I think a lot of your book does a really good job at putting forward for your argument. Given that we have 23 minutes, there are kind of broad themes around the questions that I'm noticing, and one kind of broad theme that comes across is a question around whether ANZUS is more a reflection of our deeper cultural ties. Is there something to be said for the fact that, you know, we as a country separated from the nationality code with the UK in 1949, and then almost kind of jumped headlong into the protectorate of the US ANZUS alliance. So is there something cultural going on? Is there an inferiority in Australia's cultural reckoning around our foreign policy, do you think? Is this what's precipitated these quite restrictive treaties in your mind?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good question, and I think my answer at least is partly yes. You know, as I said, and I think is kind of commonly accepted amongst historians and analysts. In the 1940s, Australia looked out into the world and was afraid. You know, the Australian government felt alone and incredibly vulnerable, and so looked for that other kind of bigger strategic power. And there's certainly an argument that they've done that. You know, that Australian governments have done that and continue to do that because of those shared values with the United States. And, you know, for one thing, that's why I was careful to make that distinction between what governments do and the broader relationship and what people do, because Australia clearly does have a long history of exchange and cultural affinity with the United States. That exists and existed separate to the security relationship. And I don't want to discount the value and the depth of that relationship. But, you know, what that question of shared values, I think, often obscures, you know, when Australian and American governments point to freedom and democracy and the values of liberty, et cetera, and the rule of law, is obscure the way that we assume that those values aren't shared or inherently clash with other countries. You know, of course, I'm talking here about China, and what that does in Australia, at least, is lead us to excuse extraordinary breaches of those values by the United States constantly. And those breaches are always deemed as acceptable, and, you know, we have to put up with them because we need American protection, but they are inexcusable by other countries. And I think it's that, again, it's that binary framing that is really dangerous for Australia.
Well, given that you've said the foreign policy C word, I might go there now, and ask. I mean, has the global power shift, which is playing out kind of as we speak, we can assume that China is rising. How long do you think this symbiosis reinforcement of existing shared values can survive, or would survive into the future? What would happen, and then consequently, what would happen for this relationship to change? What would need to occur?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good question, and I probably don't know the answer of what would need to change for that to be kind of faced head on, the nature of those shared values, because, you know, I think a lot of people expected that the Trump administration might prompt some kind of reckoning about you know, what it would take for that relationship to change. I guess, you know, I think it's so difficult to talk about China in Australia without being kind of deliberately misconstrued. It's hairy to walk, I think, as somebody who looks at the US-Australia alliance. What I would say is that so often the question of a rising China or the rising threat posed by China is understood in Australia as completely separate, as completely divorced from the exercise of American power and our support of American power. And so, you know, the exercise of Chinese power, in much the same way that the United States has exercised power, is seen as existentially threatening, again, when, you know, the United States doing something similar is completely acceptable. That's not to minimize, you know, I think we need to hold several things in our head at once. That's not to minimize very real moral concerns with the actions of the Chinese Communist Party. But again, I find that ANZUS really distorts our understanding, our ability to approach those questions with complexity and nuance, and instead encourages senior Australian bureaucrats to talk about the beating drums of war when it comes to China, and in almost the same breath, the protection afforded us by ANZUS. So again, I just think the ANZUS Treaty, that relationship with the United States, just distorts strategic thinking and almost precludes the possibility that we could work towards a relationship or a world where we feel less threatened, where we don't have to be afraid, where we build deep and nuanced diplomatic relationships with the countries in our region.
On that, I mean, because this is sort of my bent and I hold these numbers in my head for some godly reading, the China as an example, their foreign direct investment into Australia is about a quarter of what the US is at the moment.
Yeah.
Would we need to see, in your mind, do you think, a significant shift towards those kind of deeper relationships, not just diplomatically, not just foreign policy, with Indonesia, with Thailand, with Laos, with Cambodia, etc., and China, but also economically, to kind of escape this sort of pull towards the US?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's certainly an argument for economic diversification, and there should be one in Australia. You know, we should be diversifying away from an economic model that's kind of based on digging things out of the ground and selling it overseas, because that creates its own vulnerabilities. I guess what I would say is there's a tendency, though, partly again because of ANZUS, to treat those questions of those economic ties and military relationships almost entirely separately. You know, there's this idea that we can have a almost purely trade relationship with China, and that can be isolated generally from our military relationship with the United States. That is shifting, I think. I think there's an increasing I guess, willingness to connect economic and military coercion. But I think, as I kind of try to argue in the book, it's not necessarily just about economic diversification and kind of, I guess, spreading ourselves a bit differently in the structure that we find ourselves in. It's about actually revisiting that structure itself and understanding how Australia operates in the world, how that the connections between our military relationship with the United States inform our economic behaviour and our economic behaviour in the region, which again is a kind of, I suppose, a long-winded way of saying that, you know, I don't think just a bit of diversification really is enough. It requires almost a complete mindset shift.
Mm. Well, and to that, actually, there's a question here on where do you see, if any, the opportunity for Australia to evolve our relationship with the US to one of more equal partnership, or if not equal, diversified partnership? And is there any precedent for this historically, I guess?
Yeah, well, I mean, there is, I'm not sure precedent is the word I would use, but there is an example, you know, just quite close to us, in that we talk about the Australia, New Zealand, United States Security Treaty, but New Zealand was kicked out in the 1980s by the United States. So there's certainly precedent for leaving ANZUS, but that was a very different situation. You know, New Zealand had elected an anti-nuclear government that refused to allow American nukes and nuclear-powered submarines into its ports, and was basically kicked out for that reason. So there are certainly opportunities, but I think Australia and the United States have a very different relationship to the relationship New Zealand had with America. And, you know, I didn't speak at length about the deep physical security enmeshment of Australia and the United States, where we have a joint defence facility in Pine Gap from which the United States could launch a nuclear strike if it so chose. We have 2,500 Marines on rotation on Australian soil, and so actually extracting, you know, if the Australian government ever wanted to do that, you know, reforming a relationship with America would be a very difficult process. The way that where I see opportunities, I think, is not necessarily directly with governments and the way that governments exercise foreign policy. It's in more, I suppose, grassroots or democratic connections between things like Black Lives Matter's protests in Australia and the United States, or in the children's climate strike, and the rise of things like the Sunrise Movement in Australia and the United States. So again, that kind of speaks to a broader reckoning with foreign policy, and how that vast disconnect between the exercise of foreign policy in Australia and democratic accountability.
Now, I know that you said you wouldn't make predications, and you wouldn't make known alternatives, but there are actually a couple of questions based upon how ANZUS has shaped Australia's relationship with the world. Mm-hmm. And so perhaps using your fantastic historical knowledge to kind of maybe enter into some alternative historical fiction. I'm wondering whether you could comment just quickly on how ANZUS has defined Australia's interaction with the rest of the world, and do you think we would have built stronger ties with our Pacific neighbours had ANZUS not been as thoroughly encompassing?
Yeah, well, I mean, historical counterfactuals are like my favourite thing in the world, James. So I'm happy to indulge in those. You know, I think I guess I will try and go back to the source of ANZUS and it's the way that it was born out of the Second World War. I think it's, as I kind of tried to explain, you know, Australia's choice to go with the United States, given the threat that had been posed by Japan, is often seen as entirely logical. And the question I often get is, you know, well, if we hadn't looked for protection from the United States, like, who else is there? Where else would we have gone? And my answer to that is to actually, in terms of counterfactuals, to look to Europe, and to look to what Europe did in the aftermath of the Second World War, which was not to build these security treaties based on, you know, seeing former enemies still as enemies, but on reconciling France and Germany, which had been enemies not just for decades but for centuries, and deeply integrating their economies and their polities into what has now become the European Union. You know, what would our region have looked like if the Australian government at the end of the Second World War had looked out with empathy rather than fear, had looked out hoping to construct a world in which war became so much more difficult, the way that that played out in Europe. And I think it's really important to ask those questions, to see how choices and structures create the world we live in today, but to see how that wasn't and isn't inevitable.
Yeah, well, then to that, there are questions around whether one can draw comparisons between ANZUS and NATO. You know, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has created somewhat of that singular security protectorate, I guess, against the common threat of Russia, most primarily. Is there room for something like that in the future then?
Yeah, look, I mean, I certainly think there's room for it, and there's certainly an appetite for it in Australia. You know, I think most Australian governments would be absolutely delighted and would pursue an arrangement like NATO, in which there is a mutual security guarantee, or at least, you know, as close as it is possible to get to a mutual security guarantee, which is very different to ANZUS. You know, the wording is very different to ANZUS, and you'll remember that maybe the uproar when Donald Trump kind of suggested he wasn't going to reiterate the importance of Article 5 of the NATO treaty when he was president. So there's real fear, I suppose, about that. I would suggest, you know, that NATO and its origins in the Cold War do have some I suppose, parallels in what ANZUS does, in that much of NATO's origins and the origins of the Cold War really misread, again, Soviet intentions in the Cold War, in seeing a threat where there wasn't necessarily one. You know, there wasn't necessarily plans for communist global revolution, but there were plans for securing the borders of the Soviet Union. And I think there are clear parallels with the way that ANZUS sets Australia up to see China in that regard. So I suppose, you know, as much as there is room for a kind of NATO arrangement, my hope is that instead of building a situation where we have those blocks of countries pitted against each other, you know, much as Joe Biden is talking about aligning the democracies of the world against autocracies, we work towards a world and an arrangement where we don't have to line up against each other, you know, where we have genuine relationships that aren't threatening. And again, you know, I know people will respond to that idea with the suggestion that it's naive, and, you know, I'm kind of getting used to that now. But it's really, again, I would reiterate that I don't think it's naive or wrong to aspire to a world in which we don't have to make these deep security arrangements because we're afraid other people might attack us.
Mm. Well, the normativity behind the sentiment is one that I think everyone can kind of get behind. But to that question, then, is there a sense that consequently, because as you noted in the book, we've had successive Australian governments side with the US. Mm-hmm. Does that actually reflect the Australian public's sense of trepidation about the world?
In some ways, yes, it does. I'm sure many people would have seen just recently in the last few days, the United States Study Centre has published a poll which suggests that something like 40% of Australians think that the ANZUS Treaty makes Australia safer. And to be honest, I kind of suspected that it would be higher than that, because there is this bipartisan consensus that ANZUS does make us safer. I think it's understandable, absolutely, that people think that. I think we are fed a narrative through foreign policy and media that, again, that we face this existential threat that we need protection from, and that requires, you know, kind of closing our eyes and letting the Trump administration get away with some of the most heinous policies, because we still need American protection. And much of that is tied into the narrative we see about China and the Chinese Communist Party in Australia, tied to existential threat. So I think certainly Australians are encouraged to see the necessity of ANZUS in that way. But importantly, I think there's also very little support for deeper military ties with the United States. I think that poll only put it at something like 15%. There is, I think, a reluctance amongst the Australian population generally to do things like, have American missiles on Australian soil, or have the US president be able to launch a nuclear strike without consulting, and using facilities on Australian soil like Pine Gap. So certainly I think there is that reluctance, but again, that's not reflected in the exercise of foreign policy.
Well, and we are swiftly running out of time, so I'm going to run through these questions now as quick as I possibly can. Putting aside the racial dimension in our alliance with the US, as you put it, against China, against the enemy, is there still strategic advantage to the ANZUS Treaty? And presumably there was when it was signed.
Well, look, that's certainly the assumption. Again, that it gives Australia a strategic advantage because of our closeness to the United States, in a very material sense, in that it gives Australia access to, cutting edge American defence technology, though, importantly, not a discount. Our special relationship doesn't get us that. But that's certainly the argument that there is strategic value. And it's often taken so far as, to be argued that Australia needs to follow the United States into war wherever it's waging war and why ever, in order to maintain that strategic advantage, to maintain that relationship with the United States and the promise of American protection. So I think if we understand the world in those very kind of cold, realist ways, then sure, there's a strategic advantage. But my question to that would be, at what cost? At what cost, not just to us, but to the people of the world. And again, we can see the consequences of that playing out in Afghanistan. Is Australian participation in the war in Afghanistan worth that kind of nebulous strategic advantage? I don't think so.
And then lastly, I think because there are so many questions and we're not going to get to them. The last question that I wanted to pose was one of you spoke about there needs to not be that binary choice anymore between the US and China. We need to escape that kind of binary choice. Is there a sense at all, though, that we're not the only ones, we being Australia here, we're not the only ones in that discussion? And actually by gaining complexity or gaining, by developing a more robust foreign policy that doesn't sit in either camp, would we inherently incur the wrath of either the US or China by doing so, by not deliberately choosing one side or the other?
Look, I think that's certainly the assumption. And, we have encountered the wrath of the United States before from somebody like President Nixon, who was outraged that Prime Minister Gough Whitlam tried to pursue a kind of modicum of independence, and that risk is very real. That if in a future Australian government ever tried to extract itself from that security enmeshment, that we are subject to the whims of whoever is in the White House, and we might feel better that that person happens to be Joe Biden at the moment, but there's no guarantee that it will continue to be Joe Biden. I think that there are certainly many elements in Australian politics that are hoping for a return of Donald Trump, in which case, we return to that situation where we are potentially subject to the wrath of the United States. But I don't think that necessarily means, we have to side unquestioningly with the United States. These are really difficult questions, but we need to face them. And I also don't think it necessarily means that we will suffer the wrath of China. If Australia pursued a nuanced and a relationship with China based on a genuine understanding of both the Chinese government's intentions, but also China more broadly, I would hope, have a chance of developing a relationship where we don't suffer the wrath of China. And I think, you know, this question of suffering the wrath of China, again, can't ever be separated from our support of American power. That's always deeply connected. So again, you know, I would hope that we aren't facing a situation. I think it's a really false and shallow understanding of the world to suggest that we have this either or choice, because I just don't think that is true. And, you know, even if it was, the choice of America doesn't necessarily make us safer, I don't think.
Well, on that very particularly hopeful point, we have unfortunately run out of time. I apologize profusely to anyone whose question I wasn't able to get to. I was trying to involve as many themes as humanly possible, but we've had a significant amount of interest, and with good reason.
You do send me an email or shout out to me on Twitter. I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. You've had the invitation by Emma to harass her via Twitter. So make use of it. Thank you so much for being with us today, ladies and gentlemen. Emma, thank you so much. It's quite a necessary book. We've had comments to that in tonight's session. To those of you who would like to go and read the book, I highly recommend that you do. The book is Our Exceptional Friend, Australia's Fatal Alliance with the United States. The author with us tonight is Dr. Emma Shortis. This is the Australian Institute of International Affairs Victoria. Thank you so much for being here, and we hope to see you soon. Emma, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.